Good morning, everyone. My name is Gretchen Wall. I am the coordinator of the Produce Safety Alliance and also an extension associate that's based in the Department of Food Science at Cornell University. All right, so what I'd like to talk to you about in the next couple minutes is specifically the requirements around produce safety for buyer requirements, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about regulation. So specifically what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation is for raw agricultural commodities, fruits and vegetables. So I know Roxanne talked a lot about processed foods and 20C licensing. What I'm talking about here specifically are whole fresh fruits and vegetables, not chopped, not prepared in any way. They're coming from growing all the way to harvest and then onto the buyer. So that's what we're going to be talking about, the requirements related to those. But continuing with the thread of food safety, I'm sure we all, as we approach the Thanksgiving season, you all can remember some of the outbreaks that we had last year related to romaine lettuce, and we've been seeing a lot of these outbreaks in the news. But foodborne illnesses really do affect a number of people in this country and internationally, and specifically those with fresh produce. As you know, fresh produce, if you're eating a salad, you're not cooking that salad. There's no way to reduce any microbial contamination. And what I mean by that would be things like bacteria, like E. coli or Listeria or Salmonella. You're eating these things raw. So that's one of the concerns with fresh produce, is there's no cook step that would kill those pathogens off. Foodborne illnesses also affect marketability and profitability. If you recall, back in 2011, there was a pretty big outbreak associated with cantaloupes out in Colorado. And those cantaloupes had Listeria on them, which is a really nasty pathogen that can cause severe illnesses. It can cause death. It can cause fetal abortions. But that actually caused those individuals to serve some jail time. Their business went under. It was unprecedented. That was the first time that had ever occurred. So when this happens, it has significant and severe impacts to businesses, especially if it's traced back to a particular farm, which with new technologies and new science, we're able to more accurately trace back where some of these outbreaks are coming from. But for the most part, there's a lot of, we don't know where it's coming from. It's extremely difficult. Fresh produce is highly perishable. So by the time that somebody eats a product, gets sick, maybe even goes to the doctor, not everybody, if you have diarrhea or you're vomiting, if you're a generally healthy person, you kind of push through it. So a lot of people don't end up actually going to the doctor to actually have a sample of their stool taken. So it's very hard to confirm foodborne illnesses that are associated with fresh produce. But when it happens and we're able to trace it back, we have seen some pretty severe consequences as a result of those outbreaks. So as a result, over the years, we've seen quite a few of these outbreaks. And you'll see the regulatory requirements have shifted. And I'm going to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act, specifically the Produce Safety Rule, which is the first ever federal regulation for fresh fruit and vegetable producers. But it's also shaped industry standards. 10 years ago or so, it wasn't quite as common for buyers to be asking those food safety questions, but now they're asking those questions. They may require you to have a third-party audit, which we'll talk about. And then also it can affect consumer confidence. So just as an example, back in 2006, you might recall that there was a really big outbreak of E. coli in spinach. And what I'm showing on the screen right now is actually week by week what happened during that outbreak. So you can see at week 0 what the sales of leafy greens, specifically bagged spinach, is that dark green line. At week 2, it was down 60% of sales, and it took nearly 68 weeks, which is about 6 months, to recover, not even to where it was before that outbreak occurred. The other really interesting thing is that those lines that are above, those like sort of lighter green lines, the dotted green lines, and then the solid green lines that are above that 0 line, those are other types of greens. So bulk lettuce, romaine hearts, iceberg, even those products, even though we knew this outbreak was only associated with spinach, even those other types of leafy green products had a huge decline in sales over that period because consumers were afraid to buy any type of green product. So not only did it take the market a really long time to recover from that, but it affected products that weren't even actually affected in this particular outbreak. And that in turn affects buyer preferences. If you're not confident that the product you're eating is going to be safe and going to be good for you, long term, you may choose not to buy bag spinach, or you may choose to buy from a local farm, or you may choose to buy something frozen or something else that's prepared. So all of these things kind of roll into how people make their decisions about the foods they're eating. Once we start talking about some of these regulations related to produce safety, I want you to know that this didn't happen overnight. This is actually an evolution that's been occurring over the past almost 20 years now. But back in 1998, the CDC had been monitoring data, looking at, what kind of foods are people eating that are causing illness that they know actually traced back to a particular food. And they noticed that produce was one of those higher on the list that were causing these outbreaks. So they issued some guidance. We call it the green guide, but it's essentially a guide to minimize microbial hazards in fresh fruits and vegetables. Around 2000 is when the buyers started. They saw this guidance come out and they said, oh man, I'm a buyer. I want to make sure the produce that I'm selling to my consumers is safe. So buyers started sending letters to growers saying, hey, what are you doing for food safety? I want to know so that I can provide some assurance to my consumers that the products I'm selling in my store are safe. I would really say that 2006, that outbreak where I showed you the decline in the spinach, that really was a major game changer for the industry. That really caused a lot of people to pause. There were 3 deaths as a result of that outbreak. There were 205 illnesses, 104 people were hospitalized from that outbreak, which is a really high number because in that particular outbreak, it was caused by E. coli 0157H7, which actually causes hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is basically kidney failure. So it actually ended up having 104 people hospitalized with 31 people who were in kidney failure. So that really, I think, raised awareness of, wow, these things can, when they happen, they can be very severe. So there were some commodity specific guidelines that came out as a result. And right around 2009 was when the FDA said, okay, maybe we need a federal regulation about this, because prior to that time, it was just completely based on buyer requirements driving those practices being implemented. In 2011 was when the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule was signed into, the FSMA overall was signed into law, and then 2015 was when the specific Produce Safety Rule was finalized and published in the Federal Register. And now here we are with staggered business sizes and compliance date starts, which I'm gonna show you here in just a second. But I just wanted to show that this didn't happen overnight. This has been an evolution. And now we're at the point where we have a federal regulation that may or may not apply to your business. And I'll show you some tools that will give you a better idea of whether you fall in this regulation or not. I also want to be very, very clear that there are 2 influences here that you need to be aware of. One is the FSMA regulation, so that's a federal requirement. And then the other are what we call third-party audits. So third-party audits are completely separate from the regulation. A third-party audit is something that a buyer would ask you to complete in order to sell your product to that particular buyer. So for example, Wegmans has a strong presence in New York. Wegmans does require a third-party audit in order for you to be able to sell your product into their stores. Not all buyers are going to require the same audit. Over time, there has been some effort to try to harmonize, what specific audit growers should be doing, but ultimately that is up to the buyer. So if you're selling into a new market, and the buyer says, hey, I want you to have a third-party audit for food safety, you have to ask which one, because there are a whole bunch. So USDA offers audits. The Department of Ag and Markets will come and do those audits. There's Tesco, there's Primus, there's Global Gap, there's NSF. I mean, there's a whole number of companies that will do audits. So it's very important that if you're being asked to do an audit, that you actually ask which one and which scopes, and we'll get in a little more detail into that. But again, these two things are separate. So you don't necessarily have to have an audit for the regulation. The audit is completely buyer driven, and the regulation is completely a federal requirement. And just in the bigger picture, the Food Safety Modernization Act has several different rules. So the produce safety rule is just one of those regulations. You may have heard a little bit about the preventive controls for human food. That is more for processed food. There's also preventive controls for animal feed. And there's foreign supplier verification, things related to third-party auditors. There's also sanitary transportation requirements. That's more for like larger shipping of food products, prevention of intentional contamination. And then what's really interesting is just this past 2 weeks, FDA has come out with a proposed traceability rule that has the potential to affect some produce products in addition to other food products. It is a proposed rule at this time, so they are soliciting comments, but that's an additional rule that comes under the whole framework of FSMA. And the whole premise of FSMA is to prevent contamination rather than try to react to it. Because as I mentioned before, it's very difficult to trace foodborne illness outbreaks. It's very difficult to figure out where that contamination is coming from. So we really want to focus on preventing it in the first place. With the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule, though, I want to drop this in the chat just so you guys have it. There are a few exemptions and exclusions that could apply to your farm if you're growing fresh fruits and vegetables. So the link that I just dropped in the chat box is actually a flow diagram from FDA that walks you through a series of questions that helps you figure out, am I covered by this regulation, or am I exempt or excluded for some reason? So there are some that are based on business sizes. So if you're a very small business, meaning that you sell less than $25,000 worth of total produce sales, you won't be covered by this regulation. There are other exemptions and exclusions that are based on commodities grown. So that's what we would call the rarely consumed raw exemption. So if you're growing something like potatoes, we know that potatoes, when you cook them, you're going to reduce the potential for foodborne illness. And not many people that I know, unless you're eating a completely raw food diet, are eating raw potatoes. So if you're cooking the product, it's assumed that you're likely killing off any pathogens. So there are some exemptions for rarely consumed raw products. There's exemptions for products that are going toward another kill step process. So let's say you grow Roma tomatoes and those are going to a paste manufacturer. They're going to be canned into a can and made into paste that would have a heat treatment that would take care of those pathogens. I already mentioned average annual produce sales is another way you can figure out whether you're covered or not covered. And then there's also this thing that is a little bit challenging to navigate, but it is called the qualified exemption. And it's basically based on two factors. One is the total food sales of your business. We're not just talking about produce anymore. We're talking about all of your food sales. So if you sold honey and meat and cheese and eggs, all those things, that would come into that total. And then also where you're selling those products. And I don't have time to get into all the details during this particular webinar, but you will see in that flow diagram, it'll give you those thresholds. And I'm more than happy to answer your questions. I'll give my email at the end if you have questions about the qualified exemption. Ultimately, it's really important that all growers understand food safety because it affects your farm and your business and the people that you're feeding your food. So even though this is a federal regulation, you may be exempt from it. I think it's extremely relevant to everyone to understand food safety risks and how to prevent them. In terms of compliance with the produce safety rule, like I mentioned, it was published in the Federal Register back in 2015 and really came into effect in 2016. You'll see in that chart, there are compliance dates for business sizes, and that's based on produce sales. So that $500,000 number you see there, that's total produce sales. The middle column is really the one that you want to be looking at, compliance dates for most produce. So for the largest businesses, they actually had to start complying with this regulation in 2018. For the very small businesses, this January, their compliance dates kicked into effect. So essentially this is into effect for all farm sizes at this point. FDA did provide additional time to comply. There are some requirements for water testing and agricultural water. So we're talking about irrigation water, wash water for post-harvest washing. There are specific requirements in the rule that may be a little bit more challenging for growers. So they did grant extra time for the water-related compliance dates. So essentially, you have 4 additional years to comply with subpart E, which relates to ag water. There are also a couple different enforcement discretions happening right now. There are some for hops, wine grapes, pulses, and almonds currently, which I can share more information about if anyone's interested. And then they also just issued, not just, but this spring they issued a COVID-related enforcement discretion specifically for qualified exempt farms. There are still inspections happening. So that's not to say that, you know, everything is on pause and none of the inspections for the produce safety rule are happening. They absolutely are. It's just that certain farms who are qualified exempt may fall under that enforcement discretion while COVID-19 is happening. So shifting from the regulatory picture and going to the buyer demand side, it's really important that you recognize that even if you're exempt from the produce safety rule, the federal requirements, you may not be exempt from food safety practices at the business level or at your buyer's level. And I've seen everything from small farmers markets have requirements all the way up to, you know, large retailers who have specific buyers requirements. And they want to know that there are food safety practices in place. That might be a written farm food safety plan. It might be a third-party audit. Some of these things do come with some added time and investment on the farm's behalf. So that might be improving worker training practices. It may be investing in some infrastructure related to, you know, better wash and pack facilities. There are some cost sharing programs and grants that are available to offset the cost depending on where you're located for audits. So that's definitely something to look into if you end up having to have a third-party audit for food safety. But again, audits are not required for the federal regulation. Farm food safety plans are not either, but in order to have a third-party audit, you have to have a farm food safety plan. I don't know any audit that doesn't have a farm food safety plan, and there are lots and lots of resources which I'll show you. If you need to write a farm food safety plan, you don't have to start from scratch. So there's a lot of resources I'll share here in a minute. So let's say you're going into a new market and you're interested in selling your fruits and vegetables to a particular buyer, and they say, well, I want you to have a third-party audit. Again, you need to ask specifically which one, because they're all going to be a little bit different. The questions aren't necessarily all the same. You also need to ask about availability. You know, are there auditors that are available in your area that can come out and do that? Because, you know, in certain cases, so for example, if you're doing a global gap audit, the auditor might be coming from Arizona, and you will end up having to pay for that auditor's time to fly them out from another location. So it is really important that you think about that. If your buyer is giving you any wiggle room and you know Department of Ag and Markets offers the USDA audit, and the buyer says, yep, USDA audit is great, those folks are based in New York State, and you likely would not be paying for as much of their travel time because they're local. So that's something to ask about. Also asking about the scopes. So within an audit, there will be different sections, and it may be that the buyer only wants you to have the production scope, so everything that happens in the field. Or maybe they only want you to have an audit for the packing house if you're doing apples or something like that. So that's a question to ask your buyer as well. And then also think about conflict of interest. So you don't necessarily want somebody helping you to write your farm food safety plan, pass your audit, and then come audit you. You can see how that could be a conflict of interest. You really want this to be an objective activity, because ultimately this is not just a test of one day of what your food safety practices are. This really should be an ongoing thing an ongoing evolution on your farm of practices that you implement every day. It really is a culture of food safety and not just a one day drop in, get a check, make sure that you are sanitizing your bins and people are washing their hands. It really needs to be something that's incorporated every day. And ultimately, you have to believe that there are risks. You know, if you are farming and you have soil, you have people, you have animals, you have any of those things on your farm, turns out you could have a potential food safety risk. So you need to know what those risks are and how you're going to implement practices to reduce them. That might mean that you need to gain some basic knowledge in microbiology because it's not all common sense. So some of these things we never thought would happen have happened, and having that background will enable you to better understand what's going on your farm so that you can address those potential risks. And then figure out whether FSMA is going to apply to you or whether your buyer is really going to drive those food safety practices. And if you're not sure, ask for help. I see Laura Biasillo is dropping some links in now for some opportunities, learning opportunities. There are a number of individuals across the state that work in food safety specifically beyond just myself. So please do ask for help. In terms of resources, there's lots of great resources. The ones that I would direct you to the most would be the National GAPS program, Good Agricultural Practices, has a lot of great resources like posters for hand washing. They have some training options, online training options. There's lots of resources on that website, which is gaps.cornell.edu. And then the Produce Safety Alliance is specifically training farmers to meet the educational requirements of the produce safety rule. So if you fall under the produce safety rule, the PSA grower training is the training that you'll want to attend to meet that requirement. It's not to say that if you're exempt from the regulation that it's still not valuable, because we do cover both best practices and the regulatory requirements. But information is available on producesafetyalliance.cornell.edu. If you look at the tab on the left-hand side that says grower training, you can search by location. You can search whether you want an online course. I would say the majority of courses that are happening right now are remote. So they're actually being delivered in a forum like this on Zoom just because of COVID. But there may be some in-person training events in the future. And then of course, I know Roxanne talked a little bit about New York State Ag and Markets, but more so specifically focused on FSMA. Ag and Markets does have a website specifically for FSMA resources. And then the NY Grown and Certified program is also an option. And I see a question from Dolores, is there a basic microbiology course available or one you can suggest? That's a great question. I don't know if Cornell offers anything online. I'll have to poke around. Dolores, I'll get your contact information and see. There are some good resources that I can share with you, just written resources that you can read. I'm not sure if there's any free microbiology courses that I can point you to. You know, there's a lot of micro courses you could probably take online for credit, but I will follow up with you on that. And just as another final snapshot of some opportunities that are coming up specific to New York State, Robert Haddad is offering a food safety and wash pack facility workshop. It's a virtual training, and you can register by visiting that link. That's on November 16th. I also went on the Produce Safety Alliance website to see if there are any upcoming remote PSA grower training. So again, that would be a course that's delivered on Zoom. Elizabeth Hodgson is offering one, actually only $30 if you're a New York State grower. That will be held on November 10th through 12th. And then if you want something that's self-paced, we do have an online course that does have specific start and end dates, but it's a thing that you can do at your own pace. Let's say you work best in the evenings after you come home from your other job. That is a self-paced course that you can enroll in. So those are the learning opportunities that I would direct you to. And then my contact information, if I go forward and not back, is right here. So I got my phone number, my email. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I welcome questions now as well.
Can you go back 2 slides so I can make a screenshot of the opportunities for learning? Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Any questions of Gretchen Wall? See,
Thank
Gretchen, you just did so well that all that you unmasked all that confusion. So fabulous.
I'm sure I'll get some phone calls and emails, which is great. So process the information, and I will be here.
In all fairness to everyone, that's a tidal wave of information she just threw at you. So we have no two of stick for all this stuff. So it's mind blowing, but it is navigable and there's help for it. So if you have further questions later, don't hesitate to ask any of these three that you heard this morning, folks, on for their help, because that's why they're there.
I think I have a question.
Sure.
Is there any way to get your soil tested to, to see its health condition?
Yeah, so soil testing is a little outside of my realm of expertise, but I do know that Cornell does have a soil testing lab that will test, for certain types of nutrients. But maybe somebody else on this call from CCE can speak to that, where they recommend their growers go for soil testing.
I can help you with that, Poppy. So I'll email you after the class.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Marianne, could you email that to me as well?
Yep.
I guess it's time to move along. Gretchen, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen.